Our next speaker is Deb Hilbert. Deb, are you ready?
I'm ready. I'm here.
Nice. So Deb Hilbert is she was in the urban tree and landscape management lab at the University of Florida for a number of years. She's also the owner of Many Trees Consulting, but most recently she is now an assistant professor of arboriculture and urban forestry at the State University of New York, SUNY ESF, the School of Environmental Sciences and Forestry. She researches urban forest diversity, establishment survival, planting space recommendations, and did a lot of canopy assessment work when she was down here. So with that, I will open up the floor to you so you can show some of the results of the focus groups we worked on. So,
All right. Let me share my screen. There we go. Good morning, everyone. I am coming to you from a fresh move, so I couldn't find which box I put my microphone in, so I apologize if my sound quality is subpar. But I am here and I'm excited to share the results of the rapid assessment part of this project. So just as a reminder for those who joined kind of late, prior to this forum today, a group of researchers from the University of Florida, Andrew Kozer, myself, as well as USDA Forest Service, Dexter Locke and Nancy Santi, and Bartlett Tree Labs and KC Trees, Chris Riley, we worked on a rapid assessment to understand the constraints and opportunities for creating a sustainable supply of quality, diverse, and climate-ready tree species for use in the urban areas of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So that was the big question, and what we did is we, as a group of researchers, decided to do some focus groups to better understand this question. So again, here is the research team, the primary folks who were doing the focus groups and the analysis, and we'll also be doing the final report. And then we also, for this project, have a steering committee as well as a project technical lead. And the steering committee has reviewed our methodology, looked over our focus group questions. They also provided suggestions for the different participants in the focus group as well. So they had a really strong role in the development of this project. So what we did is took the suggestions from the steering committee as well as our wider network and looked for individuals who are from the Chesapeake Bay watershed or make decisions or grow trees that influence the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So they might be just outside of the region, but they're still heavily involved. And we wanted to explore the connections in the production and procurement of urban trees between these different individuals to better understand the tree supply chain in the region, and then specifically ask for constraints and opportunities regarding the supply of urban trees. We ended up with 3 focus groups, 16 total participants. We did this back in the spring. And our participants included 4 growers. The growers themselves included B&B, bare root, container, large and small farms. We also had 3 municipal arborists or foresters, 2 landscape install or commercial reps, 5 folks from governmental agencies, so technical assistance and Forest Service, for example. We had 1 nonprofit greening employee, and then 1 landscape designer. So that was kind of the makeup of our groups. Now I'm going to give you a rundown of the results. I will just give you the caveat that, of course, I can't go over everything during this presentation. We are going to have a final report by the end of this project that'll go into a little bit more of the nuances and some of our bigger insights from the research side of things, but today I really want to show you what the participants had to share. And it includes some folks in this virtual room as well. So I appreciate those of you who participated in the focus groups to help us understand this problem. Okay, so when we asked the growers what factors influence their choices and what species to produce, as well as just the overall production of trees, We found that they have a complex decision-making process that is largely driven by market demand. So larger clients, as well as historic trends, what typically sells is going to be what they continue to grow. Large-scale, consistent purchasers like developers, as well as landscape contractors, tend to drive the market. And then the availability of liners for those growers who do not start trees from seeds or propagules. They're purchasing from the propagation growers, and so they're greatly limited by the availability of liners from those propagation nurseries. So that's the big overview. I'm going to go into some of the more comprehensive list of the factors that were shared with us by the growers. So again, demand and sales is the big one. Under that is the different customers, including those large-scale customers that I talked about, so the developers and the big commercial landscaping companies and contractors. And then historic demand, of course. So like I said, what is sold consistently in the past is usually what growers are going to stick to because it's less risky. Some growers did say that they look at what is trending for landscape architects in the region, and they try to anticipate by starting to grow those trees, but they do avoid new untested trees. So they're not going to start growing a tree that has not been proven to be successful in both the landscape and the market. Availability, again, of liners is a huge influence in the production of trees. And then the tree success itself. So growers are only going to grow trees that they can reliably and successfully grow on their farm, and this depends on the hardiness zone and the local environmental factors like soils, local pests and pathogens, whether or not the species is invasive. If it's an invasive, then they'll ditch it, and so they're paying attention to what folks like extension agents are recommending as far as the invasive and potentially invasive species. And then they also tend to lean towards the successful cultivars as well. There was a lot of talk about the importance of having cultivars that are much more hardy to environmental conditions like drought, severe freezes, and other very specific things that might affect the survivability. And then another thing that came up that doesn't really fit in these categories, but is a big theme throughout this entire assessment is growing time. It takes a lot of time to grow trees. If you look from the very start of the cycle from propagules, you can be talking about anywhere from 10 to 15 years. And then for some of these growers who are starting with liners, it can be anywhere from 5 to 8, maybe 10 years, depending on how large of a tree they're producing. So it takes a lot of time, and this time doesn't always correlate to the timeline that purchasers are working with, which we'll talk more about. And then I have a good summary quote from a grower on this topic. And they said, when we're really trying to look forward on what trees we think are going to be in demand, for us, that mostly gets back to trying to choose really good trees. Not the newest and latest, but the trees that are kind of proven and we think are going to be around for a while. Okay, so then we turned around and we asked the folks like the municipal arborists, the contractors, the LAs, what influences their decisions when they're purchasing trees for urban plantings. And of course, there were a variety of factors because we have a variety of different types of purchasers. But the major influences were, again, availability. But from this end, it relates to species, quality, size, and stock type. The tree performance and suitability to the site it's going to, maintenance requirements of the tree, and then climate change considerations came up a lot with these groups. So some more detailed results. Tree performance really came down to suitability to the site, as well as the tree function, which is a little bit different. So are they planting canopy trees? Is it a habitat restoration or a riparian restoration? Is it an aesthetic planting for a tree right away in a downtown corridor? And then it also, the tree size at planting is important too. That goes back to things like you want a large mature shade tree for canopy plantings, etc. They also mentioned, again, climate change came up a lot. That is an influencing factor, as well as pests and pathogens, especially those emerging and invasive pests and pathogens, which is related to climate change, as we know. And then availability really covers a lot of different things. Like I mentioned on the last slide, not only different sizes of trees, different functions of trees, different types of stock, but also availability of quality stock. So we heard about standards in the last presentation, but really having those trees that have high quality root systems, good structure, etc. There's also a high demand for natives, and now this reflects a lot of just the makeup of our focus groups themselves. We had several individuals who focused primarily on restoration and conservation type plantings, but these groups are also shifting to do more urban plantings and are still wanting to use more natives. And there does tend to be a higher demand for native plantings from this region, just based on my observations, even within some of the highly built up parts of the cities. So that's going to influence what they're looking for. Maintenance requirements, of course, we typically want trees that are not going to require a ton of maintenance, especially in these heavily built up parts of cities. There was also talk about limiting cultivars and using straight species, and this kind of also corresponds to the desire for native trees and the actual uses of these trees themselves. So for those species that are being used for habitat restoration, or maybe being used to increase biodiversity of the local flora and fauna, then a lot of these purchasers are wanting to use straight species and limit cultivars, which is a little bit different than what we heard from the grower side, remember, because they want to use successful cultivars that are tested and proven to be successful in the urban environment. And now we have purchasers who are coming from different backgrounds, not only arboriculture, but also conservation. So there's some discussion that needs to happen about when and where to use cultivars as well as straight species. And then, excuse me, some things like historic landscape are going to influence purchasing. So if a city is known for having crepe myrtles, then they're going to plant some crepe myrtles, as well as what other species they want to plant. Local provenance, this came up in the last discussion, but there are a lot of folks who are looking for trees that are sourced from a specific distance from the local region to make sure that they have trees that are locally adapted and also more likely to contribute to the local biodiversity. And that leads into diversity. Folks are wanting a diversity not only of species, but also a diversity of the sizes and the stock types, because they're doing all different kinds of plantings in these urban areas. Cost and funding is also influencing their purchasing decisions. And then timing. Timing is going to come up a lot, but timing of when they get the grants, how long they have to spend the funding versus the nursery cycle itself is going to be tricky, and it's going to influence the purchasing and the whole supply chain. But largely it came down to right tree, right place, which is ingrained in most folks' brains. And then as an arborist associate director said, why are you planting? So what are your goals for the project? Those are the two big things. It needs to be the right tree, and what is its purpose? All right, so then we looked into the challenges in the urban tree supply, and I split it up by growers and purchasers again, because we did get some slightly different perspectives. So from the grower's perspective, their answers primarily related to themes of, again, availability of liners. We'll hear this a lot. Again, commercial demand, timing, so the growth time and the purchaser timing and whether or not that syncs up, and then the environment. So they're going to be limited by the climate, soil, weather, etc. So a little more detail on this. So availability doesn't always mean liner availability, but also seed availability. And then if there are requirements from their clients for certain provenance, then that is another added factor in this. Again, they are businesses, these nurseries, and so they are going to be demand driven. And from what we heard in these focus groups from the growers, small municipal purchasers and planting projects that come and go, those are not going to really influence the nursery market. What's going to influence the nursery market over time are going to be those long, consistent purchases and those large, consistent purchases, which at this point are mostly coming from, again, developers and large-scale contractors and landscape installers. And going back to availability, really the liner growers out west are the ones who are guiding the market. So the growers we spoke to were not propagation growers. They did do some propagation. A couple of them do propagation in-house, but it's not their primary type of growing. They are mostly purchasing liners, so those smaller trees from propagation nurseries, and then they're growing them out to size. A lot of those liner growers are outside of the region. I don't know how much you know about this, but most of them are out west in Oregon. There's some in Ohio, but a lot of them are in Oregon. And from what these growers said, and my understanding of the market, they largely guide the overall supply of trees. Again, timing, so remember this is how long it takes to grow the tree, as well as the seasonal cycles. So digging season is going to come up for a lot of these growers, and it can be a challenge depending on when purchasers want to get trees. It may not sync up with when they are digging the trees. And then again, the grant cycle and the purchaser's timing, they just may not have enough notice to get the trees that are that are needed for the certain urban planting projects. And then finally, challenges for growers on expanding the urban tree supply. It really just comes down to the environment and biology, because they're working with living organisms. So the local climate, as well as climate change, they are aware of climate change and are experiencing it. Severe weather events can impact the overall inventory, so like major freezes or storms. And then the local soils are going to influence what they can actually grow on their farm. One thing that doesn't really fit in any of these categories, but it was mentioned, and this is really important to note, is that there's also an overall loss of nurseries. There's less folks growing, and the farms are being sold and bought up for other uses. And so this is something that's going to need to be addressed. In reference to those large-scale propagation nurseries out west, a local grower said that those guys pretty much own the chain of all that stuff regarding the propagation of trees. So this is a really important part of the supply chain that purchasers may not always think about, especially if you're not familiar with the urban tree supply chain. Okay, so then when we ask the consumers, so again, those are the urban greening folks, the nonprofits, municipal foresters, LAs, etc. Their answers regarding challenges really related to themes of, again, availability, commercial demand, timing, environmental and urban site constraints, limited availability or limited ability to shape the market, and then a lack of knowledge on purchasing logistics. So what it really takes to buy things from a nursery if they're just now getting into planting. So we'll see these themes come up over and over again, really in all of the different aspects of our questions. And that's a really important takeaway. So when we dig in a little bit closer, when it comes to availability, quality was brought up a lot. So urban tree purchasers want quality stock. And this goes back to things like the ANSI standards, as well as expanded standards and specifications. Some urban tree purchasers have specifications that go above and beyond what is listed in ANSI, and Jahan was getting into that. They also need a variety of stock sizes. So between the different types of purchasers, they're planting different sizes. So maybe for tree giveaways, they're using really small bare root trees or 1 gallon max. For straight tree planting, they're going to be using a lot larger trees. For restoration planting, that might be using in between. So between the different organizations, there's different sizes of stocks and type of stock, but then within single organizations, they may be using lots of different stock sizes. So some organizations are doing all of those different types of plantings: street plantings, park plantings, restoration plantings, tree giveaways. And so just one purchaser themselves can need a lot of different types of trees from growers. Again, there does seem to be an emphasis on native and straight species or non-cultivars, and they're having trouble finding those. And then something that's coming up, especially now with a lot of tree planting projects, is they're having to compete with other purchasers to get similar species and stock types. Again, timing. So grant cycles do not always sync up with the timing it takes to put in an order versus the time it takes to grow a tree and dig a tree and get the tree out and delivered. So managing those logistics is a challenge. Having sufficient funding and other resources to have programmatic capacity is a challenge. When it comes to staffing, it's not only the number of staff, but it is the length that staff can be employed and compensated. It is the training of the staff and how specialized they can be. This is a challenge, especially for some of these soft funded programs, which most of them are at this point, at least as far as the IRA funded programs. So that's going to be a challenge. And policymakers and lawmakers have a play in this. So a lot of this funding is ultimately greenlit by policymakers. And so that can be a challenge, or it can be an opportunity, as we all know. And then finally, the consumers shared that some other challenges in the urban tree supply is just the environmental or biological constraints. So again, the local climate change, emerging pests and pathogens, and then the challenging aspects of urban sites themselves is an issue. A grower summed up all of the challenges by saying, "I think that the challenge is having the right tree at the right place and the right quantity at the right time when these projects come up." Easy, right? Okay, so then we talked to them about some opportunities for overcoming the supply challenges, and primarily these related to themes of partnership and communication between the different stakeholders, contract growing, which kind of goes along with that, increased programmatic capacity, having nonprofit or micro nurseries, and then increase in nursery quality. So to look a little bit more closely at this, I lumped under partnership. Contract growing is an opportunity, and some are already doing this. State assistance, maybe even by contracting with state nurseries, is an opportunity that some are using, and others mentioned that they would like to look into this. There's also an opportunity to use brokers. So if your organization is not able to go out and tag trees, or they're not able to go out and quality control, finding brokers who are certified arborists or otherwise have the right credentials and experience to basically quality control for the stock can be an option. There's also brokers who help get the trees to the nursery that you're purchasing from, which is a whole other thing. So there are some different ways to use essentially like middle people to make this happen. And in a similar vein, staging nurseries or kind of staging areas also came up. So there are a couple of people from our groups who have come up with creative ways to use either their in-house micro nursery as a staging nursery for other groups. So other groups they have the money, they need to buy the trees now, but their planting is not until next season. Well, this other group has stepped in and said, hey, you can use our nursery and we'll take care of them until you're ready. So this is happening in a couple of instances, and it really just takes creativity and, again, partnership. Communication, really what folks were saying, it came down to education of the purchasers really understanding what it takes to grow trees, but also the other side of things, growers need to better understand what is needed for these highly specific urban plantings, because again, their decisions are largely driven by the large-scale purchasers, and they're not necessarily paying attention to some of these more really highly specific urban projects. Folks need to go out and visit the farm. If you have never been to the farm, you've never been to a tree farm, and you don't know what it takes to grow trees, you should go. And this also helps facilitate partnership and communication, because if you go out and you talk to the growers and you better understand their farm, it's just going to foster a long-term relationship. And that's what we heard from several individuals in this group. And then several folks are also relying on expert recommendations from folks like extension agents and researchers, as well as technical assistance from the Forest Service and other governmental agencies. And then professional organizations and meetings also was something suggested by a few of our focus group members. There are nursery and landscape professional organizations in existence already. They're fairly robust. It's a robust profession. So this is a great opportunity for individuals who are purchasing trees to start networking with those growers, connect with the organizations, go out to the annual nursery and landscape shows and conferences, because that's a way to directly meet growers and talk to them about what you need and better understand what they're growing, what they plan to grow for the next couple of years. This is something that I think is kind of low-hanging fruit. But anyways, I won't get too much into that, but this is something that folks suggested. And then finally, some more opportunities that really revolve around increased funding and resources. So again, staffing, but also workforce development. So not just the staffing, quantity and quality and specialization, but also better workforce development related to things like the logistics of getting trees to the site, staging, and the planting and maintenance. Nonprofit and micro nurseries are also a solution that are being utilized. We talked to a couple of folks who work in municipalities where they have a really small scale nursery that is run by their team. There's also in existence nurseries that are run by nonprofit groups. And then of course there's the state nurseries as well. There are ways to utilize these without competing with commercial growers. But I will say that it's not easy to just start growing trees. Folks go to school for this, or they have decades of experience and know how to do it. So it's not as easy as it sounds, but it is possible, especially if you have horticulturalists on staff who can run the nurseries. And then finally, opportunities can come from the policy and lawmakers who are signing those laws that greenlight money and resources, and as well as potential procurement arrangements. One grower summed it up as a successful tree supply relationship involves everybody coming to the table and discussing this and not bullying each other around. One of the contractors said, "We have a successful tree supply because I really believe in relationships. Relationships help you smooth all these little bumps out." And that was a really big theme that came up over and over again, is it really comes down to just forging these long-term relationships with your growers, because that'll help you get more flexibility from them, and then they're going to also rely on you for regular purchasing and consistent purchasing. You're really going to take care of the farmer themselves as well. So it's a really great symbiotic relationship. All right, so some keys, summary or takeaway. Growing choices are largely defined by what can be grown well and what sells. Producing trees and transporting trees is logistically challenging. There are long production cycles, busy planting seasons, as well as outside market influences. So I didn't get into this in the other slides, but there were some stories shared by local growers who talked about how they have to compete with growers outside of the Chesapeake Bay region, particularly in the South, to especially when it comes to native trees, but also to be able to compete with things like liquidation sales. So if a nursery in Tennessee decides that they're going to mark down all their, I don't know, sassafras or maples, then the local Chesapeake Bay growers are going to have to compete with that, and they may not necessarily be able to, depending on the size of the nursery and what they are already growing. So there are outside market influences beyond just the Chesapeake Bay region that are going to influence how successful growers are. And a lot of times folks are looking for the cheapest trees they can find, and they will go beyond to these other growers if they can. Again, relationships over time can help with these issues. So repeat bids, continuous communication, this can really shape what is available and also help forge things like contracts or less official arrangements between the purchaser and the grower. And then education of the contractors and the public can help overcome these challenges as well. There's just an overall lack of awareness of the logistics needed to have successful plantings, where to find the trees, what it takes to grow trees, and which nurseries are out there. So getting back to that communication, the networking, and the overall education that comes from technical advisors like the Forest Service and similar folks, that's all going to help with this, essentially doing things like this forum. All right, so next steps for this project. Our research team and technical advisor, we are going to put together case studies with some solutions based on what we heard from successful scenarios. There'll be a more detailed summary report, and we also plan to have a webinar to summarize all the overall findings, not only of the focus groups, but also this forum. We're going to take what we hear from you during these jam boards and during the chats, and also use that to influence our big takeaways from our study of the Chesapeake Bay region. There's also potentially an opportunity for in-person meetups. Obviously, for something like this, it's a little trickier to get in person. We wanted to be able to include everybody from the region, so online is a lot easier for that, but it would be nice to facilitate some localized meetups like nursery tours, planting project tours, etc. No promises, but if this is something you're interested in, then definitely let us know. This would be something that would probably be organized by the Forest Service and their network of folks in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. All right, with that, I will end. So we have some time for questions, but I just want to thank all of our funders again, as well as my co-researchers on this project. If you want to reach out to me, this is my best email right now. I am in transition. And then if you want to hear more about this specific project, you can talk to Andrew, and here's his email. So thank you all.
Great. Thank you very much. Getting my program up. So we have time for some questions. We have about 5 minutes for that. So if anyone has any questions, the question and answers function is working for several people. Here, there's look at all those claps, love it. And then otherwise, if you're having trouble with the question and answer session or section, we'll look in the chat as well. But Q&A is helpful for organizing those things. As far as questions, we have one from Mary asking, "What are brokers?"
Yeah. So typically brokers are folks who are hired by the contractors to go out and tag trees. So there's a whole line of people in between the purchasing of the tree and actually getting it in the ground. And so whether it's the developers or the contractors who are ultimately in charge of putting trees in the ground, they don't always go out and look at the trees themselves. They might have a whole separate group of people who they hire to go tag the trees and find the trees. Some are like independent brokers. Some work for other contract companies. But this was offered up as a potential solution because it's already being used in a commercial sense, but it's not being used typically in a like small scale urban project sense. So there's not a lot of like nonprofits who are hiring brokers, but it might be an opportunity since they don't typically have the resources or time or even know how to go out and tag these trees.
Yeah, we had we used to go through a broker down here that would just source from all over the state, getting what we needed. It was like kind of a one-stop go-to thing, which was very nice. So Dana have buyers ever contracted with liner growers or have had conversations with them to introduce new species and get them into final production nurseries?
Buyers that are contracted with liners. So the final purchasers are typically not the ones who are going to contract with the liner growers. It's going to be the growers who are growing out from the liners, and that does happen sometimes. I can't speak to the details of that because I just don't know. But yeah, I mean, they will contract with liner growers. But again, the liner growers themselves are also not going to grow trees that have not been widely tested and shown to be successful in the market, because then they may not get a repeat buyer and it might be a waste of their time to propagate those trees. So the growers on both the propagation and the large scale tree side are only going to grow trees that they know are going to consistently be successful and in demand.
Great. And then I think the last question I see was, what are some of the specifics that you're seeing in contracts?
Yeah, so sometimes it is as simple as just the species and the size and the existing ANSI standards. But then there are some municipalities that are much more specific. They put in that they require roots to be dipped, for example, or they require the trees to be sourced locally. So provenance might be specified. That's a little more rare. And then from the grower side, there's usually some sort of stipulation about like guaranteed that the purchase is going to be made when the time comes. Jahan collected a couple examples of contracts, I believe, and I think she might be able to share. Am I wrong or am I right? Yes.
Yeah, definitely. I can share those contract samples with anybody who's interested. Feel free to just email me, jahan.samaha@usda.gov, and I'll forward that to you. Someday they'll live on our website.
Nice.
Okay, well, great. We are ready for. Oh, actually, we have 5 more minutes for questions. I think there was one that popped up. Sorry, I'm going through Windows here. Where's the meeting? Here we go. Questions. This is okay. So I got to read this one. Small municipalities and other smaller clients tend to contract with landscape companies to do planting in New Jersey. The contractor is the one with all the relationships with growers and nurseries. So what the question is, I guess, how does working with a middle person like a contractor affect that relationship with the nursery? And then also, this is a question I had, talking about, because I work for the government as well, and we often have to go for the lowest bid.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you get around that in a scenario, or where you are trying to get something that's going to be more costly to produce because it's unproven, it's new.
Yeah. So we only had one contractor in the focus groups. I always try to get more, but it's tricky to find folks who have the time and also just kind of the interest to participate in these conversations, which is unfortunate because they are such a huge player, just like Melanie mentions. The contractor that we spoke to, they have had success with forging their own relationships with local nurseries, but they did kind of hint at this challenge with the bidding process for municipalities and other governmental organizations and non-governmental organizations. I don't know what the solution is, to be honest. Andrew, I don't know if you remember any solutions that have come up from our prior focus groups. I can't think of them off the top of my head.
I know at the state level, where I work, whenever this comes up for like equipment or whatever, we go as like a sole source, you know. So like, so you know, this is like the only grower that's producing this species in this size. So there is no comparable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of a Freeman maple is not the same as a sassafras or a hickory. You know, they're just different because they take different time to produce and all this stuff. And you explain this, and if you get the right person, you could probably get that worked out. But if someone's like a tree's a tree, then yeah, you're probably out of luck, unfortunately. So. But yeah, because usually with us, it's like research equipment that's so specialized that there truly isn't another comparable. So,
Yeah,
any
that's a
other
great
questions?
question. I would just add, if there's someone in attendance who has dealt with this and kind of overcome this, to share that with Melanie and the group, because I am really curious to know what folks are doing to get around this. Great question.